So I just want to say thank you for agreeing to do the talk and welcome everyone who came. And if anyone couldn't quite make the live session tonight, we will have this viewable on our website and on our YouTube channel. So please feel free to check us out at the galleries at ccbc.com. And tonight we have Mr. Jeremy Jirsa. Am I saying that correctly?
Jirsa.
Jirsa. Okay, thank you. And he is one of our artists in our Essex exhibition, And Still We Rise. So I'm just going to go ahead and start asking questions. And if anyone wants to like ask any other questions, please feel free to type them in the chat and I'll go ahead and moderate those. Okay. So we're just going to start off tonight with I would say an easy question, but sometimes it's a hard question. Is, what made you want to be an artist?
Oh, wow. Um, that is a pretty grandiose question, in my opinion. Um, so growing up, I always had an inclination towards the arts, and it was something that I always kind of excelled at. Um, my grandfather was a huge influence on that portion of my life. He grew up drawing cartoons and making comics and things like that. And there's this really sweet kind of family story. He grew up in Swedesboro, New Jersey, and this was he was born in 1921. Um, and they had this local paper. They had ads in the paper that say, "Do these drawings, send them away. We'll tell you if they're good or not." So he did that and gets this letter back, and it says, "Hey, we want you to come work for Walt Disney." And it was kind of this family myth in a way. And then he passed away in 2015, and we found the letter. And it was this really amazing moment where this kind of family myth became reality. And he always encouraged my parents to push me into the arts. It's because I had an inclination and kind of lived the life that he didn't necessarily kind of get to explore. He eventually became an electrician and then went to World War II. But his father never supported any of his creative endeavors. Famously, a family quote is that his dad said, "You'll never amount to a pinch of shit drawing monsters and comics for the rest of your life." So my parents always had that door open for me. And then my mom, my grandfather is my mom's father, and he was the only grandparent I really knew. So she really kind of pushed me to follow that talent. And then my dad is an antique dealer, so I kind of grew up surrounded by all of these weird, unusual items, and kind of the juxtaposition of these items next to one another from different time periods, from Art Nouveau to just kind of a weird kitschy 50s toys to amazing Victorian furniture. So I think that had a huge influence on me going into the arts. And then when I was younger, um, probably around 2000, I was diagnosed with Tourette's. So art became a real outlet for me. It was a place where I could escape, and during those moments of making, it was almost as if my tics and Tourette's kind of disappeared. So I wanted to hold on to that. So I kept on, finding ways to get into that headspace and continue to make and create. And I just had more and more kind of success doing it. I went to an art magnet middle school, art magnet high school, and then went to art school for college. And even kind of in college, I didn't necessarily consider myself kind of an artist in a certain regard. It took a while for me to kind of take ownership of that, but I think I answered the question of how did I get into art.
You did. I love that. That family story is super cool. That's amazing. It's a shame he never got to explore it, but it's great that it did have your family like give you that support because that's a wonderful thing to have. And then having the arts be a way for you to work through the tics and things from Tourette's, like that sort of integration into your life is amazing.
Mhm.
So I love that story. Thank you. That's a wonderful answer to the question. Um, so I'll go on to my next one, which
Mhm.
is what drew you to the smiley face slash takeout bag motif that you use in a lot of your work?
So I was working probably around 2017 with a lot of kind of post-it notes in my paintings and a lot of trompe l'oeil aspects to really push this idea of facade and what's there, what's being presented, what's not really there. Um, and I was finding myself kind of writing little notes on the actual post-it notes that were in my paintings.
Mm.
And I started to pull out either little snippets of poetry that I wrote or little memories that had an effect on my life. And I found myself kind of reminiscing on this exchange that would happen between me and my mom every day growing up when I would leave the house for school. She would always say, "Have a nice day, have a nice day, have a nice day." And I would never reply with, "You too," or "I will." It was always, "I'll try." And I really kind of latched onto that because from my earliest time kind of remembering that I never had a positive kind of outlook on the day or knew that I was kind of dealing with aspects of depression and kind of masking that to the world. So this idea of I'll try became really um, a poignant moment in my life. So I started to look for certain motifs that I could explore with this, and the literally almost um, like an urban tumbleweed coming blowing past me comes this takeaway bag that you see at every fast food restaurant or little Chinese restaurant with a smiley face that says "Have a nice day" on it.
Mhm.
So for me, I started to use that. Excuse me. I started to use that as a stand-in for the human figure, and also this mask that we wear on a daily basis to we were presenting one aspect of ourselves to the world without truly exposing what's happening underneath the surface. So that's how that comes in. And then most recently that smiley face is kind of morphed from um, the iconical smiley face that's on each of those bags that I lift and then use in my own work, to most recently bringing that into performance and creating my own smiley face mask. So it becomes kind of this avatar that I'm starting to now work into a lot of my studio practice.
Cool. I it's really interesting the way it's, you can, like you say, it's those bags, you see them everywhere. And
Hmm.
so taking that common kind of image and then using that for the concept is so interesting. Um,
Yeah,
wow.
and the bag itself, it's kind of getting phased out as more and more cities are saying no to the plastic bag. So I'm thinking to myself, maybe I have to find another motif in another way.
Yeah, or
Um,
collect all of them, like get as many
Right.
as you
And well,
have.
I actually do have a pretty extensive collection of a lot of those bags in my studio. But I also have recently been thinking, if I'm showing this work or if it ever goes kind of internationally, do would they have the same connection to any of those bags, or how does that read in another cultural context based on how these bags are used in their societies and things like that?
That's true. It could be a very American thing for all
Yeah,
we know.
right. Yeah.
Or I wonder, even if it's regional or if, because
Mm.
I'm trying to remember. I've only really lived up and down the East Coast. I'm not sure about, different regions of the US. That's an interesting thought. Okay, cool. Um, so that kind of sort of leads into my next question. At
Mhm.
least for this the smiley face, because I always think of humor and happiness, when you have the smiley face. So what role does humor play in your artwork, if at all?
Um, yeah, it's a huge role in my artwork, and it's something that I didn't really understand until I was in grad school. Up until that point, I was getting my MFA between 2015 and 2017 at University of Pennsylvania, and during that time, I had this really amazing professor, Matt Friedman, who passed away sadly during this past year. So during the pandemic, no one could really go and do anything like that. But anyway, moving past that, I had this great conversation with him one day in my studio, and we're talking about the themes in my work, and he's talking to me about how it sounds like a bad Bruce Springsteen song, and we're laughing and having a good time, and then we're carrying on, and he just brings up the fact that I'm kind of this lighthearted, charismatic person that likes to crack a joke here and there. And, I always enjoy making people laugh, but my work itself up until that point was so heavy handed in terms of um, depression and anxiety and these psychologically ridden spaces that are just inherently heavy. So does it always have to be heavy? Does it always have to be that aspect of yourself? Can you bring that comedy? Can you bring that humor in, that defense mechanism that you're using, kind of on a daily basis to make the work more rounded? So I started to think of how I could start to play with that comedy. So I started to identify certain things that I found hilarious but yet tragic. So I started with a lot of those wacky, wavy, inflatable arms kind of guys that you see outside of used car dealerships, and focusing on them and how that could be the stand-in for the human body, and then eventually moving towards that takeaway bag. Um, so yeah, that's how the humor kind of comes in, and it helps me to not take the work so seriously and have room for play within my studio practice, which up until then I was very much a painter with a capital P and being very strategic about every little thing. And this gave a little more brevity to the work and allowed more kind of perspectives to come in and observe themes that I might not have intentionally placed on what it is that I'm working with.
Cool. Very cool. Sorry, I'm still thinking about the guys with the wavy arms. I love that that interaction with, what happens today, like what we
Mhm,
see as we live our lives. Um, so with the large golden balloon sculpture,
mhm.
what was your process to create this work?
Yeah, so that was a long process. It's several iterations. It's a process that kind of I would say it took me 2 years to finally get to this um, final piece. I started making plaster casts of balloons, and they were just about 12 by 12 inches, nothing spectacular, but trying to find new ways of doing it, trying to have multiples of them in the studio space. Maybe if I stack them, what does that say? And then I came to the conclusion that I really wanted to make it out of bronze or some type of cast aluminum. I wanted this reflective quality within the work, but I also wanted I wanted it to be very substantial. And I went through several kind of foundries and ways of casting it, and none of them were working out at all. So I encountered an art fabricator while I was living in Philly, and I was talking with him about this work and how to actually go about making it, and he informed me about his studio practice, and then we worked together to actually make this piece come alive. And it is a 36 by 36-inch balloon that is cast in epoxy resin, and then covered in polyurethane as well as silver nitrate and kind of like a chrome candy paint as well, with polyurethane kind of painting in the actual smiley that's on that face. And I didn't have the facilities large enough to kind of make this happen, or the painting facilities to make this happen. So he was like, "Yeah, we can use my space." I'm like, "Oh, thank God!" So he walked me through some processes, how to actually approach this, and it was a really great experience. Um, and I hope to make more larger things within the same kind of realm. But the idea for that sculpture in general, um, once again, that smiley face that's always presenting itself to the world, always happy, always smiling, but yet this balloon itself, it's while it's reflecting the world around it, it's slightly deflated. It sits on the ground. You have to walk around it and approach it. So while it can't necessarily function as a balloon, or maybe how we might want to function on a daily basis, um, through this kind of floating around. Now it's just kind of hovering, and now it sits there. So how do you engage with that? And um, it's it also comes out of this idea of um, trying to be someone that you may not be within that point in time. Um, and that's how the balloon came about.
Oh, that's okay. So I do have a question. So
Hmm.
this is not a prepared one, so now I've got to think how to say it. But so with the 2 year process, right?
Hmm.
Um, I'm just curious because I love when I'm making my own stuff. It's equally interesting and frustrating when you come across like the failures, like the really epic failures.
Oh, there were
What
a lot of epic failures.
So which was the most epic? Like, which was the most epic failure?
I was trying to learn how to work with a foundry, and kind of I didn't want to, honestly, I didn't want to spend the money to work with a large foundry. So I ended up working with a bunch of smaller foundries that we just couldn't get the mold right. And I knew nothing about bronze whatsoever. What was nice about this sculpture was I've made several epoxy resin sculptures, and I've worked with epoxy kind of on a daily basis. So it was easy to kind of go in, and I didn't even think of it being an option at this point. But then I thought to myself, if I'm spending this much on bronze and aluminum to try and make this happen, I'm just going to go ahead and do the same thing in epoxy resin. But ooh, a lot of hairline fractures, a lot of kind of just splitting of these sculptures, and not having them be archival or even reminiscent of a balloon in any way whatsoever. Several of them kind of ended up turning, after polishing and kind of getting them to a certain level of polish that I ideally wanted, because I wanted to try and bring it to this high shine that I have on the sculpture right now. By the time I was done polishing them, it kind of looked like maybe a lollipop that's been sucked on for a while. So everything is kind of smooth and rounded out, and there's no real definition of these features. And that's just not the aesthetic that I wanted. I wanted it to be tangible. I wanted you to kind of walk up and be seduced to want to touch it. So those kind of crinkles, and that chrome, um, that kind of false idol in a certain way, really comes through in the work.
So, okay, so that leads me to one more question. So when was because the thing that I wanted to ask about with the epic failures is because it's one thing I think is really important for our student body when
Hmm.
they're trying to make work and making work is that it's not gonna it's not gonna just happen. Like there's
Yeah.
process and things are gonna mess up. I could say another word, but I can't because we're recording it. And so that perseverance to keep going forward is really important. But
Mhm.
then when was the moment when you had like the aha, when you're like, nah, this is it. This is going in the right direction. Do you remember?
For that sculpture specifically.
Or that or really any piece that you really like were working on and it wasn't going right and then finally you had it, like
For that piece, in general, I got to a point where I just said, "F it, I'm gonna throw everything possible into this. It's gonna be my last shot. This is the rest of the money I have right now, and I'm gonna take that risk, and I'm gonna just see what happens. And if this doesn't work, then I know it's not a tangible idea." Um, but that was up until probably within that 2-year period. That was up till like the a year and a half point. And then it was kind of in the height of the pandemic as well. So I didn't have much going on, and it also became something to look forward to work on. And I didn't have a kind of fear of it not necessarily working out, because I didn't have any shows coming up. I didn't know what the art world was going to be like. So it was a process of making this for myself, and knowing that I had to accomplish this goal for myself. It's interesting that you bring that up about the students, because I talk about this all the time within the classes that I teach, specifically with the idea of curation and what it is that we're seeing on a daily basis related to social media. Everything that our students are seeing now. They've grown up in a curated existence. Um, so if we relate that to the studio process, everything that is being made in the studio isn't necessarily going out into the gallery, out into the world, being shown on Instagram, being shown on websites or these different platforms. The same thing relates to everyday life. I mean, some people do post every little thing that they're doing within their day, but for the most part, it's a curated existence. So that idea of the studio being a safe place to work, testing different ideas, seeing what sticks to the wall, seeing what falls down and crumbles, and then picking and choosing so that you can then take this more conceived body, put it out into the world.
That's an awesome point. Thank you. I exactly. It's this. I can't even ask another question to make that answer better. That's awesome. Um, Thank you. Let's see. Oh, okay. So here's a question about a different media, which is how did you get into working with neon?
Mm. So I was working as an art handler in Philly, and I was going up and down between Philly and New York constantly. And I had the opportunity to work at MoMA PS1 and install several Bruce Nauman pieces. And I really just kind of saw the simplicity of the neon and started to work with the idea of words in my work, and then starting to think of the neons as sketches and how I can bring a three-dimensional sketch into some sculpture and see how that goes. So that's how that started to be incorporated into my work. I made this installation um, of my own handwriting. This is my first neon piece of my own handwriting that was written backwards and facing the wall, and the front of it was painted black, but the back of it was lit, so it was lit facing the wall, and it said "Wish you were here" um, in my handwriting. So it was this projection to kind of no one. So it's almost as if we're looking at the back of a sign to a kind of a window, or the way you would see it in a bar, looking out into the world, advertising people to come in. But it's this advertisement to a wall. So it's broadcasting to no one, almost in the way a cry for help would be if you were to post it on social media nowadays. So that kind of became my starting point with the neon, and then bringing that in kind of more sculpturally, I guess, to many more of my pieces. Also, the idea for the neon in general. I have dealt with a lot of self-medication in the past, dealing with the Tourette's and not necessarily knowing how to kind of cope with it. Specifically, being from a very blue collar area, you didn't really go and see a therapist or anything like that, and just being aware of how people around me related to stress, related to trauma. They just went to the bar, they went and got something to drink, and that's how they dealt with those problems. So I wanted to bring that aspect to the work as well, and in a way that can be seen as some dark humor in another way. Yeah.
Yeah, I really can. And trying to think. So with that idea, does it also talk about a little bit? And this is just me spitballing, but like with the neon being to the wall, is it like is it the idea? Maybe this is too little, but like running up against a wall of communication, or kind of that blockage of being unable to like that to get that communication or thought or need out to the world? Is
Yeah,
that
I think so, because um, it's literally an advertisement to a blank space, to an inaccessible space. So it's that lack of communication while you're trying your best to get as much attention as possible, but yet the attention's not being seen, whether you want it to be or maybe you don't want it to be. So those kind of dualities within the work.
awesome? Thank you. Thank you. Um, I have, let's see, two more questions. So if anyone has any questions in the audience, please feel free to start typing now. So my sixth question prepared question. I know I've gone off track here a couple times, but what's the most difficult part of creating your work? And then what is the most fun?
The most difficult part of creating my work, wow. I think right now, the difficulty, well, the trajectory that I'm coming out of, with the pandemic and everything like that, I went through kind of a huge existential crisis with the work. What's the point when everything in the world is so heavy, it's a little hard to think about how heavy every day was now that we have access to people and vaccines and things like that. So to be trapped in a room and a building for X amount of time, it made me kind of think about, I have a lot of work that is extremely personal. It comes from um, a huge place of self. Almost every work in a way is a self portrait for me. So what makes me so important that I need to broadcast this out to the world? And then I started to think of how much other people were feeling the same way, and were even more in tune with what I was making pre-pandemic, now that they've experienced a lot of the same things that I felt on a daily basis in terms of self-isolation and dealing with trauma. um, Now it's kind of a unifying factor in a sad way, but that's coming through. But that gave me the footing to start to move forward with my work. But in terms of the hardest part about making the work is, um, right now, sitting down and finding time to do it. I have to force myself to get in there, and once I get in that headspace of making, it'll be fine, and I know that, and I'm back in it. But sometimes it's just that little extra kick to get there, kind of like going to the gym in a way, especially when you are working several other jobs. I teach at multiple schools, so most of my free time is taken up by teaching. So getting into the studio, it becomes a second job. I have to work to make my work. And then that work takes on its own life. But the best part about making, for me, is that moment where I get lost in the creation of the work. And it doesn't happen as much when I'm working with sculpture as much as it does with painting, because my sculptures tend to have a lot of found objects. There are a lot of time-based situations where things have to sit, cure, after a sculpture is being made. But whenever I can have my hands constantly moving and constantly working, and I kind of, you enter the studio with all these voices, and then as soon as those voices leave, and then it's just my voice, and then as soon as I leave, and it's just me in that moment, that's the best part of working.
Something a little meditative about it, maybe.
100%, yeah, very cathartic, and you just kind of get lost.
I understand that's the part I love the best when I'm making work. It's that chance to just focus on that
Mhm,
one thing. It's wonderful. Um, so I have my last question, which is, you have a podcast that
mhm.
you do where you are actually in the interviewer seat and you
Yeah.
talk to other artists. So what made you want to start doing that?
So it was during the height of the pandemic. I wasn't necessarily, there was a point where I didn't have access to my studio because, things were being cut off. We didn't know how that studio building was going to function with all the people in it. So I was kind of stuck working at home for a little bit, and then I ended up breaking my femur, knock on wood. So I was in a full leg cast, and I really couldn't get to my studio or make. So I thought to myself, how am I going to kind of continue, one, something creative, and two, open up a dialogue for all of these artists that are locked in their own spaces and not communicating where we would normally communicate, either through studio visits or at openings, out really talking about the art. So it became kind of therapeutic in a way, and just opening up this dialogue. So that's how that came about, and it just kind of started to snowball. I just said, why not? The other people are doing it. I'm just going to reach out to artists and see what happens. And I reached out to several of artists that I respect, several of artists that I've had as professors, and I've interviewed artists from London, Justin Mortimer, who's an amazing figurative painter based in London, Lou Ross. He is a painter in Paris. I've interviewed Katie Pumphrey, who's also a Triple Crown swimmer, long distance swimmer. She is a painter based in Baltimore. And then I interviewed Ken Tiza and David Humphrey, and reached out a couple feelers to a couple other artists, but some of them they wanted to do it, but due to certain gallery stipulations, some of them were not allowed to, which is a little heartbreaking. But I won't say any names. But yeah.
That's a shame, but I mean, yeah, there's contracts involved, so
Hmm.
that's understandable. That is super cool. I'm gonna have to tune into that. I'm gonna have to listen to some of those. That sounds like so much fun.
Yeah, and I when I started it, I started kind of with my circle in the beginning. So not only is it a podcast where I interview artists in the fine art medium, I interview musicians as well, and illustrators and graphic designers, and hopefully eventually I'd like it to grow into me just kind of moderating a conversation between two artists of different realms, and seeing where those crossovers are. So in the beginning, I started interviewing my friend Akil, who's in a great Baltimore hardcore band called End It. Talked to him about his work, how he got into music, and then also going as far as to interviewing. Oh my god, I'm blanking on his name. Well, interviewing several artists from several different genres. And yeah, it's been a wild ride. You're surprised who will respond to you when you just genuinely ask without any kind of um, intention, I guess, or false narrative.
Well, I can kind of understand that in a way because there's times when, like when we for the galleries, like I email an artist that I've never worked with before, whose work
Mhm.
I've just seen, and I'm kind of like just it's a cold call almost out there, and it is kind of amazing how many people are really willing to be like, yeah, sure, why not? It's super cool. I remember when one of my first shows that I curated, I mean, it's the second show I really curated. We were doing it was illustration based, and we reached out to like there was an art director from Supergiant Games, Gen Z. We asked her, and she was willing to do it. And I contacted. He was actually one of the artists I looked at when I was in college, John Jude Palancar, who's an illustrator, sci-fi fantasy illustrator. And I thought there was no way in the world he was going to say yes. And boy, did he say yes. And he came out and did the show and did a talk on site. And I fangirled all over the place. I mean, it was just, so it is the art world can be very warm and welcoming. And that's,
Yeah,
the important thing, especially in times that like we're going through now, even though
yeah,
we do.
that's how I felt with Sean Harris was the name I was looking for earlier. He was in a band that I followed growing up called The Matches, and did the whole Warp Tour thing. Became a big kind of pop punk star with Epitaph Records, and now he's an illustrator. So that was a weird moment for me, reaching out and then having this kind of fanboy moment. And then even with artists like Justin Mortimer, who's someone whose work I've idolized since I was an undergrad. And then him just saying, after coming off of an international show in Korea and then another show in London, saying, "Oh yeah, cool, yeah, I'll do your podcast." And yeah.
That's awesome. So awesome. Okay, so I'm going to open it up to the audience. If anybody has any questions they'd like to ask, please feel free. I don't want to dominate the conversation too much, but I'm having a really fun time talking to you. So this is really, really cool. Oh, here we've got one. So this is from Emily. Now that you've finished the large balloon project, do you have a new big work that you're jumping into?
So I've started to pivot slightly into some performance based work, along with some more installation based things. So I've been planning out several performances, as well as another large balloon piece that will hang on the wall instead of um, sit on the floor. And that piece, it'll be it'll be a very heavy piece for myself, as it'll be called Morning Sun. Um, and mourning spelt as if you are mourning or grieving for someone, and then sun spelt as SON. Um, Talking about kind of my relationship with my mom. And I in 2000, either 2016 or 2017, I had a suicide attempt. And during that time, I had left what was basically a note to my mom on her voicemail. And luckily, I did not succeed in that attempt. But that kind of experience, and seeing how my mom dealt with that fallout, and how to this day, um, it's still, in the back of her mind, her son, her child, and dealing with that relationship. We're on great terms, but that memory still sits in the back of her head. So I wanted to explore that with that kind of piece, and the idea of the inflation, this breath almost that's there, but it's encased in a very hard structure. But the balloon will be black, in a matte black, and then the smiley face itself will be in more of a gloss black. So and it's up on the wall high enough, so it's kind of this rising sun. So it's almost like a phoenix in a certain way, rising from these ashes. So there are these, once again, these dualities of the heavy weight, but yet the kind of the floating or airiness of the piece. So there is some positivity within that negativity,
Mhm.
and going from there.
I love the dichotomy of that and just the poignancy of it. Um, I'll be interested in seeing that one when it's completed. So please keep me
Will
posted.
do. Yeah.
But it was really great talking to you. I think that we'll go ahead and wrap up here.
Yeah. Thanks for
We
having me. I really appreciate it.
Oh, thank you. I absolutely love your work, and you've been a joy to talk to you. So thank you so much.
Thank
And
you.
I guess with that, I'll say, everyone, please have a good evening. And if you want to watch the talk again, it will be up on YouTube and on the website. So come check it out. Tell your friends. Okay. So everyone, have a good night, and thank you so much.
All right. See you later.